Hello, friends, and welcome back to Breaking Bread for You with an updated presentation on the story of David and Goliath from the book of 1 Samuel 17, one of the most incredible episodes in the life of this great king that has brought encouragement to countless souls struggling against relentless enemies and obstacles. Yet there is a consensus out there that the underlying reason for the inclusion of the story in 1 Samuel was to show how Saul was an unfit ruler, with David's victory over Goliath serving to justify his replacing Saul as king over Israel. So it can be said that the real contest was not between David and Goliath, but between David and Saul. However, I take it that there is an even greater purpose to this story, and that David's trust in Jehovah's faithfulness to deliver God's people from the Philistines was a correction of the lack of Israel's trust in their God, believing instead that a human king would deliver them from their enemies, which in the end proved fatal to Israel's sovereignty in the land. Unfortunately, this misplaced trust in human leadership is prevalent in the United States today, and those who, although claim to follow Yeshua Messiah, Jesus Christ, instead put their trust in the ones they vote into office to solve our nation's many problems. And as you might recall, the Israelites demanded of the prophet Samuel that he produce a king to rule over them and to protect them from their enemies. 1 Samuel 8. When from their very beginnings, Israel was a theocracy, a people ruled by their God, who would appoint mediators, judges, and priests and prophets to keep the people from going astray. And although Samuel warned Israel that a king would exploit them, as they typically had done and continue to do, they pressed him until he gave in to their demand. And with Jehovah's permission, Samuel anointed Saul, the Benjaminite, as Israel's first monarch, 1 Samuel 10:1, with the expectation that he would live and rule in accordance with the Torah, God's law that Moses received on Mount Sinai. Yet Saul failed to live up to that expectation, as had most of his successors. 4 centuries later, Judah's king Zedekiah also failed in that respect, walking in the ways of his faithless predecessors of both the northern and southern kingdoms, whose wickedness resulted in the Assyrian invasion and deportations that began in 733 BC, and the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem in 587 BC, when the temple was leveled and thousands of Judeans exiled to Babylon. Now, as of late, the story of David and Goliath has been re-examined by those whose interest is in the Nephilim, Hebrew for fallen ones, that are first mentioned in Genesis 6. And they are the formidable offspring of the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, the rebellious angelic beings who lusted after women, or the daughters of men. And so it has been presumed of Goliath that he was descended from the Nephilim, which is the focus of the study. And interest in the Nephilim has recently grown due to dubious reports of gigantic angel-human hybrids of old making a comeback, in spite of the lack of empirical evidence that we would expect to have, such as skeletal remains, which conspiracy theorists claim have been confiscated by government officials around the world. If you've seen images of gigantic skeletons and skulls on social media, like these in this frame, supposedly taken before those government officials had gotten to them, a closer look will reveal that they are Photoshopped images, and very poor ones at that. But hold on, I will show you actual skulls of extraordinary size that supports the biblical records of giants having walked this earth, as do other ancient writings and traditions from around the world. So let's read Genesis 6:4, the first mention of the Nephilim, the term derived from Nephalia, which is Aramaic for giant. And I quote from Young's literal translation on the left side of the frame, derived from the majority text of the Masoretic Hebrew version of the Old Testament, that was completed around 1000 AD. And it says, the fallen ones were in the earth in those days, and even afterwards, when sons of God come in unto daughters of men, and they have born to them. They are the heroes who, from of old, are the men of name. However, the fallen ones, or the Nephilim, are not mentioned in Genesis 6:4 in the much older version of the Old Testament, the Greek Septuagint, seen on the right side of this frame, that was completed during the 2nd century BC for Greek-speaking Jews in Alexandria, Egypt. Instead, Nephilim are referred to as gigantes, Greek for giants, and I quote, now the giants were upon the earth in those days, and after that, when the sons of God were wont to go unto the daughters of men, they bore to them. Those were the giants of old, the men of renown. Notice here that it is not even hinted at that the giants were anything other than human, merely referred to as giants, men of renown. And then there is the issue of the identity of the B'nai Elohim in Genesis 6:2, Hebrew for sons of God, or huio to theo from the Greek Septuagint, as to whether they were human or angelic beings. And that needs to be established in order to understand the nature of their offspring, these giants, the men of renown. Now, about our subject, Goliath, it is never said in 1 Samuel 17 or elsewhere that he was a giant in either the Hebrew or Greek versions. Instead, it is stated in the Hebrew version that he was a Philistine Hi'ael, verse 36, an uncircumcised Philistine to be exact, as well as a Gibor in verse 51, Hebrew for mighty warrior. And in the Septuagint, Goliath is referred to as an Anea Dunatos, a mighty powerful man, indicating that he was a fierce man of war and nothing more. So let's read 1 Samuel 17 to find out where it may have been taken that Goliath was descended from the Nephilim, whom many assume descended from a line of angelic hybrid beings. And beginning in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 17, it says, now the Philistines assembled their armies to battle. They were gathered at Soko of Judah and camped in Ephes-Dammim, between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the men of Israel gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, then lined up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines were standing on the mountain on one side, and Israel was standing on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. And continuing in verse 4, it says, then a champion stepped out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, that is 9 feet 9 inches tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and a breastplate of scale armor. The weight of the bronze breastplate was 5,000 shekels. That's 125 pounds. He also had bronze shin guards on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. That's about 5 feet long and 2 inches thick. And the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron, or 15 pounds. And his shield bearer was marching ahead of him. Now, it has been taken from Goliath's 9 foot 9 inch height that he was a mythically tall giant, which might not have been so mythical based on the chart in this frame, where 9-foot skeletons are labeled gigantic, in comparison to those that are 13 to 15 feet tall, the height of the titans of Greek mythology. And we do have on record a man by the name of Robert Wadlow, who measured just under 9 feet tall, as the result of a genetic pituitary disorder. And we would have many more such cases if it were not for modern treatment for such conditions, including pea-sized pituitary tumors that result in the overproduction of the growth hormone somatotropin, as well as the AIP, autosomal dominant pituitary genetic mutation, all of which resulting in extraordinary height. The conditions referred to as acromegaly, gigantism, and Marfan's syndrome. Recently, we have had celebrity athletes with such disorders, as in the case of pro basketball players Manute Bol on the left of the frame and George Murison on the right, both having reached 7 foot 7 inches in height. And even taller is Sultan Kosin at 8 foot 3. And as already mentioned, the tallest man to date was Robert Ludlow at 8 foot 11 on the left. And women are not exempt from reaching such extraordinary height, as was the case with turn of the 20th century Madame Aboma, who measured 7 foot 6, with the tallest woman to date, Chinese Yeo Defen, at 7 foot 7 inches, who holds the Guinness World Book of Records for the tallest woman in the world. But it is those like the great Kali who not only have the height, but the muscle mass, a likely picture of what Goliath looked like, that caused Saul and his troops to back off. Without treatment, the victims of gigantism, the disorder that begins in youth, or acromegaly that begins in adulthood, will not only grow far beyond the normal range of size, but many will develop distinctive facial features of protruding brow or lower jaw, enlarged tongue and nasal bone, spaced out teeth, extremely large hands and feet, and barrel chest, a description of the media character, the Hulk. Unfortunately, acromegaly affects 1 out of every 200,000 people in the world, whereas gigantism is much more rare, with 100 recorded cases to date. And as I promised you, in this frame is the image of a 3,800-year-old skull uncovered in California, contrasted to a normal human skull. Scientists believe that this individual had acromegaly or gigantism, as has been considered of other such unearthed skulls, a 1,100-year-old Native American skull from Illinois, and a 600-year-old skull from New Mexico. And in this frame is the oldest image of a skull understood to have belonged to an individual with acromegaly that was uncovered in 1903 near Beit Khalif, Egypt, said to belong to Pharaoh Sennacht of the 3rd dynasty, 2700 BC. And there are many more such credible finds of skeletal remains from various eras that show signs of acromegaly and gigantism. And it is from those remains and the knowledge we have today about the genetic mutation and the diseases of the pituitary gland that we can argue that Goliath's extraordinary size was the result of one of these disorders. And this might also be applied to the giants of the Bible encountered in Canaan by the Israelite spies in Numbers 13. Now, contrary to the report of Goliath's 9 foot 9 inch height from the Hebrew version of the Bible, is the Greek Septuagint's report that he was only 4 cubits and a span tall, that is 6 foot 9 in height. Although 6 foot 9 at that time and place would have been extraordinarily tall, given that the average height of men was around 5 foot 3, he would not have been considered to be anything other than an abnormally tall man. Certainly not one of mythical size or supernatural origin. And about the 3-foot discrepancy of Goliath's height between the Masoretic text and the Greek Septuagint, it has been suggested that the greater height was either a copyist error or an exaggeration intended to make David appear all the more a victor. This is evident in the additional material in the David and Goliath story in the Masoretic version, verses 12 through 31, that is not found in the Septuagint, in which is emphasized that David was the underdog. And it explains how it came about that Saul allowed him to fight the giant in his place. The Hebrew version begins with David's father Jesse sending young David to the battlefield with food for Saul and his troops, including his 3 older brothers, who are not kind to David when he shows up, making him all the more an underdog. And in the additional text of the Hebrew version, Goliath is portrayed as being all the more formidable, where it says, beginning in verse 24, "And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, 'Have you seen this man who has come up?'" Now in verse 26, it is added how very much killing Goliath was necessary due to him having defied the armies of God. And it is outlined in verse 25, the rewards that would be given to the one who would kill Goliath, saying, "Surely he," Goliath, "has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel." And I take it that this was meant to show how David had earned his position in the royal household of Saul, as would eventually be the case, even being given the princess Michal in marriage, 1 Samuel 18. And in verses 38 through 40, we have the added account of Saul offering David his armor, which he refused, making this humble shepherd boy, as he is portrayed, look all the more brave and mighty, who recounted how he had killed the lion and the bear with his own hands, 17:36 and 37. And then we are told that he took up 5 stones from the brook for his slingshot, a most humble means of weaponry. Then David is portrayed as a man of great faith in the God of Israel in his reply to Goliath's taunts, and I quote beginning in verse 45. "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with the sword and the spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Now, if the editor of 1 Samuel exaggerated David's height, then we would have to ask if the biblical record of the 7-foot 6-inch Egyptian that David's mighty men killed, 1 Chronicles 11:23, and the king of Og of Bashan, Numbers 21, whose iron bed is said to have measured 13 feet long, and all the other reports of post-flood giants of Genesis 14 are valid. And it is evident that the giants who were not killed by Joshua and the Israelites had been pushed into Philistia, to the cities of Gath and Ashdod, where they settled in their own groups, Joshua 11, where David and his mighty men killed Goliath and what remained of the giant's family. Although we don't know what the various groups of giants had to do with one another, it is thought that the Anakim were directly descended from the Nephilim, and that the Raphim were descended from a different progenitor, Rapha, from whom Goliath descended. Whatever the case, let's examine the report of the spies returning for Canaan, first quoting from the Greek Septuagint, where it says, "And they brought a horror of the land which they surveyed upon the children of Israel, saying, The land which we pass by to survey it, it is a land that eats up its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of extraordinary stature. And there we saw the giants, and we were before them as locusts, yea, even so were we before them." Numbers 13:32 and 33. However, from the later Hebrew text, the giants are referred to as the Nephilim in verse 33, with the parenthesized editorial addition that says, "The sons of ENOCH are from the Nephilim." Again, I would rather go with the report from the earlier Greek Septuagint version, since the latter Hebrew version was edited and possibly influenced by an extra biblical source which I will shortly show. Now, we know that Goliath was a descendant of Rapha, but it is never stated any place in Scripture that Rapha or his descendants were the offspring of angels or supernatural angel-human hybrids. Certainly, if that had been the case, it would have been mentioned. And based on that, I take it that the Rapha and his offspring, the Raphaim, the Anak and his offspring, the Anakim, and the rest of the extraordinarily large and mighty warriors were wholly human, very large and formidable humans, plausibly the result of acromegaly or gigantism, as was likely the case with Goliath. And we know that such genetic mutation is hereditary, as was evidently the case with Goliath, who had a gigantic brother named Lachmi, 1 Chronicles 25, and 4 gigantic sons, 2 Samuel 21:22. And where it is reported by the Spies in the Septuagint in Numbers 13:33, and I quote, "We were before them as locusts," this is clearly hyperbole, which, if taken in the natural sense, would mean that the Canaanite giants would have been hundreds of feet tall, like the one depicted in this illustration. Another such use of hyperbole is found in the book of the prophet Amos, chapter 2:9, in which is said that the Amorites were as tall as cedars and strong as oaks. However, cedars in the Middle East can reach 120 feet tall, and being as strong as oak trees would be unattainable in the natural. So going with Genesis 6 from the older Greek text, I conclude that at 6'9" tall, Goliath was far from being mythically tall. And given that neither the Hebrew nor the Greek version of 1 Samuel 17 refer to Goliath as a giant, we can conclude that he was merely a Giborim, a human champion of imposing stature. And Giborim is used to describe valiant men elsewhere in the Tanakh, 149 times, as in 1 Chronicles 11:11. In regard to David's mighty warriors, for instance, most of whom would have measured well under 6 feet tall. So let's review Genesis 6, where many find support for the argument that Goliath was a mythically tall giant, descended from the Nephilim, the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. And for the sake of clarity, I'm going to be reading from Young's literal translation of the Bible with some modernizing of the text, beginning in verse 1. And it came to pass that mankind have begun to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters have been born to them. And sons of God see the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took to themselves women of all whom they have chosen. And Jehovah said, My spirit doth not stride in men to the age, in their earring they are flesh, and his days have been 120 years. The fallen ones were in the earth in those days, and even afterwards, when sons of God came in unto daughters of men, and they have born to them. They are the heroes, who from of old are the men of name, that is, the men of reputation. And Jehovah saw that abundant was the wickedness of man in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart, only evil all the day. And Jehovah repented that he had made man in the earth, and he grieved himself in his heart. Now, my first take on the sons of God here was that they were humans who married women who were off limits to them, not rebellious angels who were attracted to and procreated with them. And I say that since Jehovah realized the wickedness of man and repented of creating him, without mention of being disappointed with supernatural wicked beings. Also, there is the issue of the inability of angels reproducing either themselves or human beings, since they are spirit beings, not having organs, nor any need for them in the first place. And we can know that they cannot reproduce based on the final word on everything. Jesus Christ, Yeshua Mashiach, as we learn from his reply concerning marriage in heaven. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. Like angels in heaven refers to them not marrying or not procreating, unable to be fruitful and multiply, God's purpose for marriage from the beginning. The idea of angels procreating with humans is illogical, given that humans and angels do not share the genetics that would make reproduction possible. If angels even have genes, which they most certainly would not have since they were not created to reproduce. And in regard to the idea that angels can reproduce, we must acknowledge that only God has the power to create life, whether through human sexual union or as he had supernaturally in Mary. Even if they could reproduce, their offspring would be hybrid. And hybrids cannot reproduce beyond the first generation, as is the nature of plant and animal hybrids. And as mentioned above, Goliath, who was descended from Rapha, fathered sons named Ishbebanob, 2 Samuel 21:16, Sippai, 1 Chronicles 24, and an unnamed son who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 1 Samuel 20:21 and 22. And that is the human condition known as polydactyly, indicating that Goliath and his offspring were most likely fully human. So what had our early biblical commentators suggested about the B'nai Elohim? Well, our earliest scholars understood that they were angelic beings, such as Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, Eusebius, Irenaeus, and Origen. And they had biblical evidence to support that, such as Job 1:6, 2:1, and 38:7, and Psalms 29:1, 82:6, 89:7, and Daniel 3:25, which we will look at below. Now, Justin Martyr of the 2nd century took the sons of God to be angels, and that their union with women produced demons, who 3rd, 2nd century Christian author Lucius Lactantius argued remained on earth since they could not return to heaven or go to hell. Second Apology. Yet beginning in the 2nd century, both Jewish and Christian scholars agreed that the sons of God were the offspring of righteous Seth, the 3rd son of Adam and Eve, whose rebellious descendants procreated with women from the line of his apostate brother Cain. 2nd century AD rabbinic literature, including the Aramaic translation of the Torah, the Targum Onkelos, portrays the sons of God, or sons of princes, as they are alternatively called, to be great men of the flood generation, not angels. Targum Onkelos Genesis 6:2. And notables who supported this interpretation were Rashi, Abraham ibn Ezra, Maimonides, Augustus of Hippo, and Julius Africanus. In fact, 2nd century Rabbi Simon Bar Yochai threatened that he would put a curse on any Jew adhering to the angelic stance, Genesis Rabbah 26:5.1. Yet the angel theory persisted up into the 20th century, when the sons of God are taken to be fallen angels. So where does the idea come from that the sons of God were angelic beings? Well, it comes from 1st Enoch, a pseudepigraphal work, that is, one whose authorship has been ascribed to a famous individual for the sake of credibility. And we can't get much more famous than Enoch of Genesis 5:24, of whom is said, "And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." The first reported case of rapture. But like other apocryphal works, 1st Enoch was not accepted into the canon of the Old Testament by the 70 rabbis who met in Yavne, Israel, during the 1st century AD in order to finalize it. And accepting that these rabbis have been called by God for that purpose, their rejecting 1st Enoch had to have had good cause. Although 1st Enoch is of value in that it informs us of what literature the people had been exposed to from the 2nd century BC forward, and from which some had based their angelology, as is thought of Jude of the New Testament book that bears his name. But it is just that, information, and fictional at that. And so let's read from 1st Enoch, which you will find has an amplified version of Genesis 6. And quoting from the R.H. Charles translation, chapter 6, verse 1 reads, "And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semjazah, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together, and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared, that's 6 generations from Adam, on the summit of Mount Hermon. And continuing in chapter 7 of 1st Enoch, it says, And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. Now, I can't find a consistent equivalent of 3,000 ells in feet, with the 4,500 feet being the most common. And in verse 5, it finishes saying, And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh, and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. And for those who rely upon 1st Enoch to explain any of the scriptures, I must point out the inconsistency herein that the angels were sent by God on assignment to earth where they rebelled, as opposed to the biblical record of the angels having been cast out of heaven where they had rebelled in the first place. And with that and other such contradictions, 1st Enoch should not be considered a reliable source for explaining Genesis 6. And given that Scripture explains Scripture, we need to look therein for other examples of the B'nai Elohim to see where they are referred to as angelic beings in order to conclude that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were such. And the next mention of the B'nai Elohim is found in the book of Job 1:6, where it says, Now there was a day when the B'nai Elohim, sons of God, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Now, sons of God are elsewhere mentioned in Job chapter 2, verse 1 and 38, verse 4, 3 instances where they pertain to angelic beings. Yet in the book of Deuteronomy, the sons of God are referred to as righteous Israelites, saying, You are the sons of the Lord your God, 14:10. And the nation of Israel is referred to as God's son, Exodus 4:22. And King Solomon is referred to as the Son of God, 2 Samuel 7:12. And so we can conclude that the sons of God can refer to angels, righteous men, Israel, and a king. And in the New Testament, Adam is referred to as the Son of God, Luke 3:38. And sons of God, huios to theo, is found in Luke 20:36, where it says, Nor can they die anymore, for they are equal to the angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. speaking of the redeemed. Also in 1 John 3:1 it says, "Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God." Additionally, Paul refers to believers as sons of God in his letter to the Romans, saying, "For all who are being led by the Spirit of God, these are sons of God. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God." Romans 8:14 and 19. And lastly, Paul wrote this to the Galatian church, "For in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith," 3:26. Now, since Paul was very well versed in the scriptures, a Pharisee scholar to be exact, it is unlikely that he would have used the designation sons of God to describe believers in Yeshua if it was exclusively used to describe fallen angels. Also, teknotheo, children of God, is used throughout the New Testament, perhaps in recognition of the righteous ones of God of both genders. Romans 8:16, 9:8, and 1 John 3:10. And of course, Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Christ, is revealed in the New Testament as the Son of God. In John 3:16, he is clarified as being the only begotten Son of God. Now, where it is taken from the New Testament to support the premise that fallen angels procreated with women, it's in the epistle 2 Peter 2:4, where it says, "For God did not spare angels whom they sent, but threw them into Sheol. He put them in chains of gloomy darkness, to be held until the judgment. He did not spare the ancient world. He preserved only Noah, a proclaimer of righteousness, along with 7 others, whom he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly." Now, it does not say that angels procreated with women, but only that they sinned. The question then is, how did they sin? Well, it is in the epistle of Jude 1:6-7, where that sin is insinuated, and I quote, "And the angels who did not keep their own position of authority, but deserted their proper place, he has kept in everlasting shackles under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. In the same way as these angels, Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after a different sort of flesh, are displayed as an example, suffering the punishment of eternal fire." Here Jude tells us that the sin of the rebellious angels was having gone after different sort of flesh, as it is put, likening it to the deviant sexual sin of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. So according to Jude, the sons of God were angels. Yet again, we have the problem of their inability to procreate. And always believing in what Jesus said above all else, the only viable explanation I can conceive of is that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were rebellious angels who possessed men, through whose body they had sex with the daughters of men. And isn't possessing bodies what evil spirits do to act out their evil deeds? So it is to ask, how could that diabolical activity result in producing angel hybrid giants? Well, I don't believe it did. To begin with, we have to concede that what was actually produced were Ish Shem, men of name, or reputation, as is written in the Masoretic text. And I quote once again from Genesis 6:4, where it says, "The fallen ones were in the earth in those days, and even afterwards, when sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they have born to them. They are the heroes who, from of old, are the men of name, the men of reputation." But in the older version, the Greek Septuagint, completed at the same time as First Enoch, plausibly having been influenced by that work, to state that the offspring were giants, and I quote that once more. "Now the giants were upon the earth in those days, and after that, when the sons of God were wont to go into the daughters of men, They bought them. Those were the giants of old, the men of renown. So could it be that the Masoretic text completed 1100 years later cleansed the Septuagint's version of Genesis 6 of one Enoch influence, stating instead that the offspring were merely men of renown? I take it that this was the case, and why wouldn't they? After all, angels mating with humans and producing giants would have been more akin to Greek mythology than the biblical records. And about the giants, the Anakim, Rephaim, and the rest of them, and Goliath and his offspring, the only logical answer to their extraordinary size, as already mentioned here, was due to a genetic mutation or a pituitary tumor resulting in acromegalia gigantism. Interestingly, it has been pointed out that the name ENOCH of the giant from whom the Anakim descended actually means ornament, as used in Proverbs 1:9, where it mentions chains of gold or ornaments around your neck, necklace or neck bands, also used for goiter, suggesting that he had hyperthyroidism from an underlying pituitary disorder that caused his gigantism. And so, beyond discovering who the sons of God are and their offspring were and how they do or do not relate to Goliath, what must we walk away with from the story of David and Goliath that really matters, that would affect our spiritual lives? Well, if we take this story to be about David's trust in God's faithfulness to deliver Israel from their enemies, as a correction of Israel's futile trust in human kings to deliver them from their enemies, the application is obvious. Do not put your trust in human leadership, the man you vote into office to protect and prosper you. For history has well proven that they are incapable of doing that, and in fact have brought about wars, exile, and poverty for the people they are expected to serve. A reading of the book of Kings will show this to have been the case with ancient Israel. And if God did not save them from calamity due to their faithlessness, He is not going to spare us. Although we might get a great president or a governor or whatever, they are only as great in protecting and prospering us as God allows them to be, and only for as long as they are in office, which never seems to be long enough to finish the job. And any good that they will accomplish is most often reversed by their successes. So our focus should not be on making America great again by human effort, as was chanted in the last two elections, but on making Christ and His kingdom great again, by turning from our sinfulness and faithlessness, seeking His will always and in everything, so that God will heal our land. We must ask ourselves that if we can't straighten our church with its many divisions and failures, how can we straighten out Washington, D.C.? From the Amplified Bible, I quote what most have heard but seem to ignore. And my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek, crave, require as a necessity my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear them from heaven and forgive their sin and heal their land. Remember that our enemies are no contest for God and that the battle is His. Satan is made powerless to those who are truly in Christ. We are not underdogs, but victors in Christ, as Paul said. Yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us, Romans 8:37. And remember, underdogs are not powerless and ineffective, but simply unknown and unappreciated. And that can change after just one victory. And let me say that our giants may only appear unconquerable, having weaknesses disguised in various ways. For instance, it has been recognized that Goliath did not see David's stone coming at him due to visual impairment caused by a pituitary disorder. Although Goliath appeared unbeatable, as with most gigantic men, he would not have possessed the agility and speed needed to fight off a much smaller but more agile warrior, such as was the case with David. And if Goliath did have acromegaly, he would, like many, have had vision impairment, which might be why, as suggested, Goliath's shield bearer preceded him in order to point him in the direction of David. Likewise, our giants, our problems are not as unbeatable as we may think, and certainly not with God fighting our battles. Thank you for viewing, and may you be blessed by the God who loves you more than you could ever imagine, as you seek him with all of your heart, trusting in him to deliver you from all of your giants.